we have several countries, many states, multiple time zones gathered together today. And so I want to thank Seán for putting for his time and energy and generosity in putting these 3 days together for us.
So let's get started then. On the 19th of May in the year 1988, I was minding my own business, sitting in the Eleanor Pardee Park in Palo Alto, which is about 100 meters from the church that I lived in at the time, St. Albert the Great. And it's a park about maybe 3 or 4 acres. And I used to go down there in the evening times after school and sit under a tree and read or meditate. And it's a fairly big park. There's full of kids playing soccer, dogs being walked around on their leashes and, people walking around. There was a big path that circumambulated the parkway itself. So it was always really, really busy. And I'm sitting there on the 19th of May, 1988, and I'm reading Autobiography of a Yogi.
So we talked, there goes.
All of a sudden, from the other side of the park, way at the other side of the park, this woman gets out of a car and brings her dog out with her and releases the dog. And the dog makes a beeline right across the park, bisected the park, ignoring all of the other dogs, all of the people, all of the kids, playing soccer, and jumped all over me and started licking me furiously. And I found out his name was Remedy. And I found out that his owner's name was Arlen Brownstein. So I invited her to sit down in the blanket with me, and we started chatting. And when she found out that I was a Catholic priest, there was a look of horror on her face. And the reason was this. She's Jewish, and her grandmother, whom she called Bubby, it's like the Yiddish title for a grandmother, her Bubby had left Russia at the age of about 16, around 1910, to come to the States. And the plan was that the rest of the family, once she got established, the rest of the family would follow her from Russia. But within 2 months of her arriving in the States, she got news that her entire family, including her 2-year-old brother, Artsy, had been wiped out in an Easter pogrom to avenge the death of Jesus. So you can imagine she was really, really leery about, talking to a Catholic priest. And at some stage, a few months later, she played me a cassette tape, an interview where she'd interviewed her Bubby and asked her about life back in Russia. She'd come from a little village called Pieter. So you get this really, really thick Yiddish accent where Bubby is saying, Pieter is a klein städtler, more Goyish than Jewish. The Jews have it very hard. They hate us, everyone. And so her entire family had been wiped out, literally wiped out in a pogrom. And here's Arlen sitting with this Catholic priest representing the devil incarnate. So we became fast friends. She's my soulmate, and we've been friends now for 34 years. The year after that, her mother came to visit. Her mother lived in Florida, in a community in Florida. And Arlen decided to take her to Mass, where I was saying Mass in St. Anne's on Palm Sunday, 1989. Now, the Catholics among you realize that on Palm Sunday and on Good Friday, there's a reading of the Passion from different gospel accounts. And typically, instead of reading it, it's acted out. One person will play the voice of Jesus, somebody else, the voice of Peter, somebody else the voice of Herod, somebody else the voice of Pilate, and then the group plays the voice of the crowd. And so here I am, dressed in full Roman Catholic vestments on Palm Sunday, 1989, and Anne Brownstein and Anne and Arlen are sitting in the pew. And we hear this reading and this enactment. And Pilate says, I am innocent of the blood of this man. And the crowd shout out, his blood be upon us and upon our children. And for the first time at age 42, I realized just what the impact of those words had been. This woman's mother's family had been wiped out because of this protestation, this alleged response of the mob 2,000 years before. And I reacted in total shock. The amazing thing was that Anne never held it against me. Anne Brownstein never held it against me. And I would visit her in Florida occasionally, and she would introduce me to her Jewish friends. She would say, this is my son, the Catholic priest. In actual fact, she died at the age of 97 in 2017, in October 2017, aged 97. And her husband had just celebrated his 100th birthday, Itzi, in March of the same year. And she died on the 21st of October, 2017, and he died on the 29th of October, 8 days later. And as she was dying, Arlen was with her at the time. She took off a necklace which she had worn. She bought it in Israel when she was visiting Ireland. Arlen studied in UC Berkeley. She majored in Near Eastern languages, particularly Arabic and Hebrew. And she spent a year studying in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And her parents came to visit. And Annie bought a necklace, not realizing it was a Christian symbol. It's a fish. And when Annie was dying in 2017, she took off this necklace and gave it to Arlen for me. I've never worn any piece of jewelry in my entire life. This is the only piece I've ever worn. So I dedicated this book to Annie Brownstein, as well as to my brother Seamus and my uncle Noel. So that is the reason why I began reading this book. What I realized is that the New Testament, had vilified the Jews, and the Old Testament had vilified God. And so what I was attempting to do in this new book was to try to show how God had been vilified, by the stories we made up about God. And so let me now introduce kind of why I wrote the book in particular. When I look at this Judeo-Christian God, there's a huge problem. Euphemistically, it's called the difficult passages. And mostly if you attend a church in a Christian church, they censored these pieces. You didn't actually get to hear a whole lot of them, maybe apart from like the plagues of Egypt and the slaughter of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. But basically they centered out the bad pieces. But the result is being nurtured on these stories has led to the following problems. Firstly, religion has shot itself in the foot by promoting this, caricature of God. This all-loving God has been reduced to a hateful monster. A fictional caricature, has left generations of Christians cowering in fear of eternal damnation. Innocent people have been dragged before inquisitions, tortured and killed because of this God. And this God's own behavior has been the justification for all kinds of human evil perpetrated. If God can do it, why can't we do it as well? And finally, after almost 2,000 years, when it was safe to do so, millions escaped into agnosticism and even atheism because of the God that was being promoted by the Judeo-Christian scriptures. And if you had the temerity to ask a priest or a rabbi or a Christian minister, why don't we object to this? They'd say to you, shh, don't anger him. You could be next. Or how dare you question God? How dare you question God's motives? Or he's God. There's reasons for doing what he did. Or obviously the people he killed were bad people and they deserve to die anyway. Now, I didn't like the picture that was being painted, and I didn't like the results of what happened, and I certainly didn't like the excuses that were being made. So I decided 3 years ago to put God on trial for crimes against humanity. And that was the purpose of the book. But when I set about doing this task, I realized that in order to kind of biblical, God needed to look at the history of the Israelites, look at the development, look at the notion of what do we mean when we say the revealed word of God. What does revelation mean? And I needed to look at the notion of biblical inerrancy, that the Bible somehow is infallible. So I needed to get that done before I could actually put God on trial. But in order to understand those concepts, I needed to understand how the human mind itself works. And so part one of this book is called Setting Psychology Free. Because if we don't understand how the mind works, then we don't understand, how we deal with stories or scriptures of various kinds, and therefore we can't understand what's being said about God. And so in part one of the book, I looked at epistemology and ontology and cosmology. They're just parts of psychology. In part two of the book, then, it's called Setting God Free. Part one was called Setting Psychology Free. Part 2 is setting God free. And this was the main focus of the book. It took up the most pagination of the book. And it's a trial where I had a prosecution, and a defense of God. Part 3 then was, having set God free, I wanted to set spirituality free, to differentiate between dogmatic religion on the one hand and mystical spirituality on the other hand. And then finally, in part 4 of the book, because my undergrad major was pure mathematics and mathematical physics, I wanted to set science free. So that's part 4 of the book, is setting science free. I wanted to liberate science from a fundamentalist, materialistic scientism in which there is no such thing as consciousness. Our consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of the bioelectrical activity of the brain. And then I ended the book with a discussion of what I call mysticists. And mysticist was a term I made up many, many years ago, which is a cross between scientist and mystic. And I believe that that is the future of humanity. People who are au fait and conversant and expert in both mysticism and science, and can create a truth, in which the inner and the outer worlds, are aligned with each other. Now, obviously, I can't produce a 400-page book. And so for the purpose of this retreat, I decided to focus just on the first 3 parts of the book: setting psychology free, setting God free, and setting spirituality free. I won't have time to get into setting science free. So setting psychology free, what did I have in mind here? So I started off with, I just made up a kind of a story or a metaphor for what I was trying to do. So imagine you have like a 4-year-old child, a boy child particularly, and you've just bought a huge jigsaw puzzle, a 500-page jigsaw puzzle. And you've taken it home and you've taken off the cellophane wrap and you've taken it out of the box and you've tumbled all the pieces onto the dining room table. And now you're going to spend the next 3 weeks assembling this jigsaw puzzle. But in the meantime, you need to go out to the backyard for a few hours to do some weeding in your back garden. So you leave all the pieces on the table. And while you're there, your young son discovers them and he starts scattering the pieces all over the house. There are pieces in the bathroom, in the dining room, in the sitting room. Moreover, your dog, has found a cornflakes box and shredded it. And there's pieces of the cardboard box scattered, intermixed with the jigsaw puzzle pieces. And you come in and you discover to your horror that your entire jigsaw puzzle is scattered all over the house. And what are you going to do? Now, they all look the same. They all look like brown cardboard on one side and colored cardboard on the other side. So you have to try to figure out how to differentiate the pieces. But the first thing you have to do is you have to gather up everything, because you have no idea yet, what's cardboard box, what is jigsaw puzzle and what's cornflakes box. And so the first thing you have to do is gather all the pieces, data collection. And that basically is what epistemology means. Epistemology is, how do we know what we know? In other words, how do we gather our data on any topic? So the first thing you employ, whether you know the word or you don't, is epistemology. You have to gather up all of the data, all of the pieces, and bring them into one location. Then you have to figure out, turn every piece over and figure out which of the pieces belong to the jigsaw puzzle and which of the pieces are part of the cornflakes box. And this is called, in psychology, it's called ontology. And ontology is the art or the science of figuring out what is true and what is false. And then the third piece is, now you've identified what the real pieces of the jigsaw puzzle are, and you've thrown away, you discard the pieces of the cardboard box belonging to the cornflakes. Now you've got all the real pieces. The next thing is, how do you put them together to create the picture on the box? And that's called cosmology. And so basically, in order to understand, set psychology free, you have to understand that epistemology is the data collection, how we know what we know. And then ontology is, how do we decide what's true about what we know? And then cosmology is, how do we assemble the pieces that we believe to be true into our personal cosmology? Now, that's the task I set myself in order to try to figure out what is true in the Bible. Where are the data, to collect the data, and then sort out what's real from what's fictitious, and then create a real story of who God is, from the pieces that remain over. So that's what I attempted to do then in the first part of the book. So let me deal with these three pieces then sequentially. Epistemology. And epistemology then is the branch of philosophy that asks the question, how do we know what we know? And I'm going to suggest that there are three very different models as to how we know what we know. So the first model, or the first way, is that we either believe an authority figure, somebody told us something, and because we believe that they're teachers or that they're, truthful, whether it's the media or scientists or priests, whatever it is, we've heard it from an expert, and therefore we think that we know it. Or secondly, it's something that we've experienced for ourselves. We know something because we've experienced it. How do you know the taste of ice cream? Nobody can explain to you what rum raisin ice cream tastes like. You have to taste it for yourself, and then you know what it's like. Nobody can convince you that consciousness survives the death of the physical body until you have a near-death experience yourself. And then you know that consciousness survives the death of the physical body. So that's personal experience. That's the second way. And the third way is you just figure it out. As you look at life, you start making sense of how could you kind of put pieces together that give you a meaningful model of the life that you're experiencing. So that's the third way. So that's like the first model. But none of those three pieces are infallible because the authorities are often wrong. They know in the very same way that you know. They believe somebody who told them, or they had their experience, or they figured it out for themselves, but it's not necessarily true. And personal experiences run the gamut from absolute delusions all the way to mystical revelation. And working stuff out for ourselves can sometimes lead us to wrong conclusions as well. So that's one model of how we know what we know. A second model is that we think we know what we know through philosophy. Philosophy uses reason and logic to tell us, what's true. Or we can use science. Science uses observation and experimentation in order to arrive at truth. Our religion tells us you can believe the word of God and that will tell you what's true. So that's another model, another tripartite model of saying that's how we might come to truth. Or a third model, a third way, is looking at the difference between objective reality, which is true whether or not you believe it, like gravity. You fall out of a 10-story building, you're going to kill yourself. Whether you know anything about gravity or believe in gravity, it doesn't matter a damn. There's an objective reality, which will have consequences, whether or not you're aware of it. And then there's subjective reality. That's a level of reality that only you can know. What's a headache feel like to you? Nobody else has a headache that felt exactly like the headache that you have. So only you can know subjectively what your headache feels like. So that's a second part of that. And then there's intersubjective reality, where a thought leader or a meme creator or a storyteller creates, a meme that the group accepts, and then acts as if it's true. So some kind of a thought leader. And so a meme is to a culture what a gene is to an organism. Every organism is composed of combinations of genes of various kinds. And every a meme does that for the culture. So a cultural belief system is made up of memes created by thought leaders. They may or may not be true, but have an extraordinary effect on people. So that's whether it's propaganda or it's truth, whatever, it has an extraordinary ability to move people and convince people. So that's pretty much what I mean by the notion of epistemology. The second piece we have to understand, and how do you figure out then really what's true? And Thomas Aquinas said very famously, truth can be found only in the judgment. Truth is not necessarily found in the sensorium. Your eyes can deceive you, your ears can deceive you. So you can't necessarily find truth simply by using your sensorium. There has to be a deeper faculty that allows you to cast among the senses, the impressions created by your sensorium and decide which are true and which are not true. So Aquinas says that truth is found only in the judgment. Now, that means that faced with any proposition, whether it's a proposition in science or in the scriptures or in psychology, and the individual person, has to figure out, do I believe this or do I not believe it? So there's an internal human faculty that's called discernment. And discernment allows you to make the judgment as to whether or not you believe a particular statement, or subscribe to it, or decide it's not true. Now, unfortunately, this discernment process can sometimes be done with a deliberate, intelligent awareness, and sometimes it can be an unconscious or even an irrational reaction to what you're hearing. So the truth then depends on your willingness to see beyond the limitations of previous beliefs that you've had. It's the ability to stretch your personal cosmology. Otherwise, we don't actually see things as they are. We see things as we are. We're blinded by our cosmologies unless we're prepared to keep updating our cosmologies and researching our belief systems. So there is no such thing as a self-evident truth. There is no such thing as a self-evident truth. If there were, then there could never be any contrary opinions on the matter. But there's not a single subject, on which people universally agree. So there is no such thing as a self-evident truth. And I believe that there's a huge difference between truth and fact. I've said this to you many, many times. Something can be true, but not factual. And something can be factual, but not true. And so here's my own definition. For me, something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God or with love. And something is ultimate true if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God or with love. So in that instance, then, the question to ask is not, is this a fact? Is to ask, is this transformative? And I've used many times the parable of the Good Samaritan to illustrate that. So the story basically is, Jesus asked, who is my neighbor? He's been interrogated by a group of Pharisees, and they ask him, who is my neighbor? And Christ typically answers by telling a story. He said, one time there was a certain man who went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he was mugged, and he was left for dead on the side of the road. And a priest from the temple passed by, and he saw a fellow Jew dying on the side of the road, and he ignored him and he passed by. Because for a priest to touch a dead body would make him unclean, and he couldn't enter the sanctuary and offer sacrifice. So he ignored the dying man and kept going. A Levite went down the same road, and the Levite were like the sacristans or the temple police. And he sees a fellow Jew lying there, and he ignored him as well, because for him to touch a dead body had the same problem. He couldn't go into the sanctuary. Sometime later, a Samaritan was going down there, and the Samaritan and the Israelites at that stage were deadly enemies for historical reasons. The Samaritan saw this dying Jew, and he attended to him. He poured, wine into his wounds to try to cauterize him, put him on his own donkey, took him down to Jericho, checked in in an inn in Jericho, looked after the guy, and then said to the innkeeper, I need to go on a journey for a few days. I'll come back. So please keep feeding him. I'll pick up the tab when I come back. And Jesus said, which of those three people do you think was neighbor to the man who got mugged? And of course, the answer was obvious. Obviously, the Samaritan. Now, if you were a reporter for the Jerusalem Post and you said, there's something fishy about this story. No, I don't believe it. And you go to the temple and you knock on the door, and the high priest comes out and you tell him the story, and you say, is that true? Did one of you guys go down to Jericho in the last week and such a thing happened? And he goes in and he checks out. No, nobody from here was down in Jericho in the last 3 months. And then you go to the Levites and you ask the same question and you get the same answer. And then you come back to Jesus and say, you're telling lies. That never happened. Now, did it happen? Possibly not. Was it factual? Maybe not. Was it true? Absolutely true. Because for the people who understood that story, they were radically transformed. They understood the real meaning of neighbor. So that is what I mean by truth. When you're searching then for the truth in any proposition or in the scriptures, that is the most important question to ask is not, is this factual? That is not the most important question. The most important question is, does believing this literally transform me and align me with God or with love? Or is this just some kind of a teaching mechanism and I have to dig much, much more deeply to understand the true import of this? Then you're accessing the truth. Which brings me then to the third part of philosophy. The cosmology you create on the basis of the truths you've discovered because of collecting all of the data and deciding which ones you can believe in and which ones you don't believe in. So you pull all these data together and all these beliefs together, and you create a philosophy of life that's called a cosmology. Now, the problem with cosmology is this. For the vast bulk of us, your personal cosmology has been unconsciously acquired, and in any one situation in which you have to act, it is unconsciously accessed. And so the great teachers of history would say to us, Socrates would say, the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, if you're not radically, on a regular basis, reassessing your own cosmology, you're not living your life. Gautama Siddhartha would say, I am Buddha, which literally means I am awake. I know what the truth is. I know what transforms me. And Jesus Christ would say, if the householder knew when the thief was going to break in and steal, he wouldn't go to sleep. And so being awake to the truth is a regular thing. You have to constantly update your personal cosmology. As I said yesterday in a homily, your cosmology needs to stretch you, but it needs to make your heart sing. You know when you've arrived at a cosmology that's working for you because you'll be filled with joy. And moreover, you'll be aligned completely with love. And if your cosmology is not doing all those four things for you, you need to revisit your cosmology. So this is the journey of incarnation, creating a cosmology and a vision for yourself, which allows you to align completely with love and with God. And then periodically to update it on the basis of new experiences that you're having. So a kind of another metaphor I've used for many years is, I want you to imagine that you and every human being who's ever lived have lived inside in a huge big concrete room. And there are no windows in this room, and there are no exits or entrances to this room. All of humanity has lived its entire life inside in this huge big concrete room. There's no light gets in there. You're just adjusted to the darkness. There's no way of getting in or getting out, and there are no windows. But there's a device set in the wall. And there's a lever attached. If you pull the lever, it dispenses minced meat into the room, which you then feed on. So this is a minced meat dispenser. Now, nobody has ever been on the outside. And so you're trying to figure out, what does the outside of this room looks like? And you're going to come to the conclusion that obviously the outside of this room is just masses and masses and masses of mincemeat. And when you press the lever, it dispenses some mincemeat into the interior. So you can't infer the reality of the outside from the data that you're getting from the inside, the mincemeat. So that is what our senses do. On the outside of this room actually is another world, pasture lands, cows, a farmer, mountains, a river. And this farmer every so often brings a cow up to a mangle machine, and he mangles the cow so that when you press the lever inside, it dispenses some of this mincemeat, this minced cow, into your room. But you can't infer from the mincemeat that there are beings called cows. There are human beings who live outside where there is grass and mountains and rivers. You could not infer that from the mincemeat. So senses are the kind of the mincemeat that comes into the room. Your perception then is how you cook this mincemeat, and reality is the meal that you then ingest. Now, our cosmos is like that. We never see the metaphysical level of the cosmos. We're stuck with the physical level of the cosmos. So neither our sensorium nor our science can ever deliver unmangled reality to us. And this is what philosophy calls the myth of the given. The myth of the given is the realization that it is a fallacy to believe that our sensorium delivers an accurate one-to-one mapping of reality to us. It mangles it. Our senses mangle it as it's coming in. Our brain mangles it inside. And then our responses to it mangle it as we believe this is our reality. So that is what I mean by setting psychology free. Setting psychology free then is the realization that in order to understand any phenomenon, whether you're dealing with, driving your car to the repair shop or shopping for groceries, whatever you're doing, you have to realize that it's undergoing this extraordinary set of reductions. 2 or 3 months ago, I devoted a series of lectures to trying to understand time and understand the human brain. And what I said was that the brain obviously does not create consciousness. Obviously not. There is no way that our tiny little brain can even store memories. The brain does not store memories. The brain has two, faculties that can download memories from the cloud. There's not enough space in the human brain to download all of the experiences of this day. Today, you're going to generate billions of sensory experiences and intuitive experiences and emotional experiences that cannot be contained in your physical brain. So it's going to outsource them to the cloud. Hinduism will call that the Akashic record, or Carl Jung will call that the collective unconscious. But it is not stored between your ears. Absolutely not stored between your ears. But you've got a few organs in your brain that help you to retrieve it when you need to retrieve it. So in each hemisphere, you have an amygdala and you've got a hippocampus. The hippocampus is the organ that retrieves the data belonging to any particular experience. The amygdala is the organ that retrieves the emotions associated with that memory. So the memory is stored offline, and there are two aspects to it. There's the data attached to it, and there's the emotions attached to it. And they're separated, and sometimes they can be even split. So let's say, for instance, I'm driving my car in downtown Palo Alto, and I have an accident. I'm hospitalized for a few weeks. And my amygdala is damaged. My physical amygdala is damaged. So every time I get down to the same crossroad where I had the accident, I remember, this is where I had the accident, and I was in hospital for 3 weeks afterwards. And it's like, I'm saying, oh yeah, it's a nice day today. I like the taste of ice cream. There's no emotion attached to it because my amygdala is offline. If it was my amygdala that was damaged, if it was my hippocampus that was damaged, but my amygdala was okay, every time I got down to that crossroads, I'd be freaking out. And I have no idea why, because I can't recall the data, but I recall the emotions associated with the intersection. And so what is the brain doing? The brain is simply a kind of an antenna for kind of collecting and transmitting information. So as we're looking and listening to each other right now, your computer is not creating me, nor is my computer creating you. If my internet goes down, as it did yesterday during Mass, I don't believe suddenly that all of you out there cease to exist. I know you continue to exist. My computer is not creating you. My computer, is just an electromagnetic device that, converts, particular signals into an audio and a visual format. So the brain is basically a receiver and a transmitter of electromagnetic activity. That's all it does. But moreover, it is a huge reducer, because if the brain had to try to handle all of the data with which it's bombarded, even on a minute to minute, it would explode. And so it's a huge reducing mechanism. There's actually part of the hindbrain back here that's called the reticular activating system, the RAS for short. And the reticular activating system is a device employed by the brain to reduce the volume of the sensory input and decide what to actually focus on and what to allow into consciousness. Because if it allowed everything else in, your brain would actually explode. So the brain is a kind of it downsizes. It's like it's turning the volume of the tap away down to a trickle in order not to destroy us. And so we have to realize all of these things when we're talking about, setting psychology free, that psychology is attached somehow to a brain, but psychology is also attached to consciousness, which in some senses is the ultimate source of the physical universe, that everything exists, everything we can see and hear and taste and touch and smell is the result of an unseen consciousness, what science calls the hard question. Neither, science nor psychology nor spirituality has ever, successfully answered the question, what is consciousness? And so I put that to my guides several weeks ago in a dream state. When I'm dreaming at night, sometimes I'll ask a question of my higher self or my mentors or whatever, And so I said, I want you to give me a one-line description of consciousness. And I woke up in the morning, and the phrase that was burned in my mind was, here's consciousness is source-saturated self-awareness. Consciousness is source-saturated self-awareness. It's the origin of all awareness, but it is absolutely saturated with source, absolutely saturated with God. So there is nothing in the first which does not come from consciousness, and there's nothing in consciousness that does not come from source. And so that was the task I set myself then. Before I can get into, setting God free, and putting God on trial, I had to figure out, what does it mean to have a human brain? What does it mean to be a self-aware a creature? What does it mean then to set psychology free? And if I can set psychology free, I can begin then to examine, truth as I find it in the Bible, or the stories I find in the Bible, or the projection I find in the Bible. And that's what I hope to pick up on, in the second lecture this afternoon with God's help, that having kind of set psychology free for myself. I want to look then at the notion of revelation in the second lecture. What does revelation actually mean? Because we have, very, very often misconceptions there. Secondly, I want to look at the notion of biblical inerrancy. What does it mean to claim that the Bible is the revealed word of God, that it is inerrant or infallible in some senses? And I also want to just give a little kind of a bunch of what I call biblical tidbits, interesting little pieces of information about our Bible. And then I want to tee up the discussion and the prosecution's case by putting God on trial. So God willing, that's where we'll go, this afternoon and for the next 3 days. So open up to you guys. I believe that the skeleton of any cosmology revolves around asking and answering 4 questions for yourself. The 4 questions are very simple. First question is, who do I think God is? Is God this, ogre in the sky who's going to send me to hell for all eternity for eating sausage on the Friday? Or is God some kind of benevolent grandmother figure, who videotapes everything all of our children does? And so the first answer the answer to that question, who is God for me? And everybody has to figure out, given your own kind of upbringing, given what you were told about God, through your religious education or whatever, you have to ask yourself, is that the God I believe in? Or in what kind of a God do I believe? So that's the first question to ask. The second question to ask is, who am I? Whom do I believe myself to be? Am I a skin encapsulated ego? Am I identified literally with my physicality? Do I think I am my body? Or do I think I am my emotions? Or do I think that I am, my mentation, my ideas? Or am I my relationships? Or am I, the jobs that I do? So what is my own definition of who I am? How do I answer these questions? Who am I? That would be the second very, very important question to ask. The third important question is, who is my neighbor? And that's precisely what Jesus was dealing with the story of the Good Samaritan. How do you decide who neighbor is? Is it a very, very narrow description? Neighbor is literally somebody who's geographically proximate to you, that lives at the other side of the white picket fence? Or is neighbor, people all over the world? Or is it even all sentient beings? Everything with which you share not just the planet, but even the cosmos, whether they're extraterrestrials or interdimensionals or whatever, they might angelic beings. What do you mean by neighbor? And then fourthly, the fourth question to ask is, what is my mission? What did I come down here to do? I'm an eternal being. When I decided to volunteer for incarnation, what did I volunteer to do? Did I volunteer to come down here to become famous, or to eat as much chocolate as I can, or to escape life without getting imprisoned? What did I come down here to do? And I believe it is to create Christ consciousness in our planet. And so the answers to those 4 questions they'll provide the skeleton, and then you'll build around those, and you'll find that there are other questions emanating from those. And slowly by slowly, instead of just a kind of a skeleton, you have a living organism called personal cosmology, which you need to upgrade regularly. if it's not changing as you age, your spirituality is stagnant. It has to change. It has to be constantly upgraded. And that you do obviously through a whole bunch of, through research obviously, to looking at alternative perspectives and all the important topics in your life, through meditation, through time spent in nature, through looking at little children at play, because they're clued in much more than adults are typically, to join in their world, their imaginal world. And I have defined imagination for you over the years. Imagination is not the same thing as fantasy. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. That's not imagination. Imagination is to volitionally shift your state of consciousness so that you can access energies and entities in different dimensions, interact with them, learn from them, and then come back and cross-fertilize what you've learned over there with your life on this side. And kids are doing that naturally. So if you join with little children, particularly under age 6, little children are living in the imaginal realm, in the sense of the imagination, which is putting them in touch with their creativity and their future. When a caterpillar cocoons, what it actually does, it devours itself. It releases chemicals that actually devour it, and it infuses what are called imaginal cells. And it's the imaginal cells that create the butterfly out of the caterpillar. So you literally have to devour yourself. You have to devour your previous belief systems in order to become a butterfly, you who used to be a caterpillar. And kids are butterflies until we turn them back into caterpillars. So play with children. And so there's a very famous statement in Exodus, I think chapter 3 of Exodus, around verse 14 or so, where Moses has an encounter with the burning bush, and God speaks to him, and he wants Moses to go back into Egypt, where Moses is actually wanted for murder. Moses had murdered an Egyptian and had to flee, and he married the daughter of a Midianite priest called Jethro. And now he's wandering in the desert looking after his father-in-law's sheep, and he comes across this burning bush. And a voice speaks to him and wants him to go back into the land of Egypt to set the Israelites free. And Moses has a stutter. He doesn't want to do it, and he's wanted for murder. So he says to God, when I go back there and ask me, which God are you talking about? What am I going to say? And God says in Hebrew, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is always mistranslated as, I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am in Hebrew, as you cannot in a Kalenjin language. You have to get around it by a device called predication without a verb. Okay. So if you want to say, for instance, I am the king in Hebrew, you say Ani Melech, me king. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. There's all the other tenses of the verb to be, and there's a present tense of all the other verbs in the language, but there's no present tense of the verb to be. Now, I think there's a reason for that. I think it's a hugely important, spiritual and psychological insight. And that is that if you say I am and you follow it with something else, you're immediately diminishing yourself. So if I say, for instance, I am Irish, I've diminished myself from being an eternal cosmic being to being a member of a particular tribe. If I say I am hungry, I'm identifying my essence with a passing state, or I am angry. And so there's languages like Kalenjin and like Hebrew won't allow you to do that. So Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh actually meant I will be who I will be. It's a future tense. And we use it in English again sometimes, like, for instance, if you say, I'm going to Palo Alto tomorrow. Now, I am going is present continuative tense, but it's going to happen tomorrow. So how can it be a present continuative tense if it's not happening now? So I am going to Palo Alto tomorrow is actually a future intention, but it's couched in a present, continuative. So we even do it in English a little bit. So we have to realize that, to say I am, if you just say I am, that's okay, because now you're identifying with core, with the essence, with God herself. But if you follow it with any kind of condition or any qualification, you're immediately diminishing who you are and what is. And so the transition from who am I to what am I is a very interesting one. So if you choose to use the I am statements, there's a mystical meaning to that as well. And so Peter Mount Shasta has written very, very beautifully, and if you guys know him, very beautifully about this. But I have a mantra, and it's the last thing I say now at night as I'm going to bed. I have like a 5-line mantra that I say for myself. And here's what I say. I say, I am love residing in the Sacred Heart of my Heavenly Father. I am light residing in the Heavenly Heart of Mother Mary. I am Logos residing in the Heavenly Heart of Jesus. I am life residing in the Heavenly Heart of the Holy Spirit, and I am laughter residing in the Sacred Hearts of the awakened ones. So I'm taking the I am statement, and associated with love, with light, with Logos, with life, and with laughter. And so in that sense, I'm trying kind of just to move from a preoccupation with Seán to an identification with Source. Reality is a fascinating concept, Robbie, because there are very, very many different levels to reality. And so a statement I've made many, many, many times is that life is a dream that the ego is having, and the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that Source is having. And so reality is a series of nested levels. So one level of reality is that which is delivered to us by our sensorium. And that level of reality is confined to a tiny part of the spectrum. It's between 400 and 700 nanometers. That is between infrared and ultraviolet. And that represents a tiny, tiny sliver just of the electromagnetic spectrum. If you were to represent the electromagnetic spectrum as a line joining Los Angeles to New York, 3,000 miles long, if that were the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible portion of that spectrum would be the diameter of a dime, literally. And then outside that, there's 95% is dark matter and dark energy. So we're creating our maps of reality at the physical level from this tiny little sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum in a cosmos which is filled with dark matter that we don't understand and dark energies that we don't understand. So it's reality only in the sense that it's the version of truth that's delivered to us by our sensorium. So that's the level at which most of us think, when we think reality, that's what we think reality is. It's just like a single grain of sand in the Sahara. That's how, it is. But that single grain of sand exists. And if you know how to mine that single grain of sand, I was very, very beautifully by the great English mystic poet to see the universe in a grain of sand. You can do that. You can pick a single grain of sand in the Sahara Desert, and if you had mystical eyes, you can see everything that ever was and everything that ever will be. I'm thinking about William Blake, the English poet mystic. So, but for most of us, we pick the single grain of sand, and we make it our total reality, and we think nothing exists except that. Now, when we learn how to meditate or how to work with our dreams, or when we listen to children, what happens is we take a bucket full of sand instead of a single grain of sand, and we make that our reality. And then at some stage, when we evolve a little bit more, we realize that the entire Sahara Desert is the reality, and now we got this extraordinary sense of what is. And then we discovered Gobi Desert, and we discovered all the beaches of the world. And we discovered that, there are grains of sand scattered all over the planet on beaches and deserts. And then we come to the realization that when you look up at the night sky, this physical cosmos, there are more stars in the heavens than there are grains of sand in all the beaches and all the deserts of planet Earth. And all of those stars are solar systems with their own attendant planets and life forms. Now, what do you mean by reality? And you realize that that is only the physical component of reality, that there is a metaphysical level as well, which is a way, way beyond that. So now, what do we mean by reality? And so reality is the constant journey of disidentification with lower levels of reality and the re-identification with greater levels of reality. And the interesting thing is, when you disidentify with a lower level and identify with a higher level, you're not losing the lower level. any more than a tree, when it sends its branches into the sky, is leaving its root system. It's what's called transcending. To transcend means to go beyond, but to take with you what went before. And so, as we move into different levels of reality, we're not abandoning any of the lower levels, but we're gaining access to different levels. But there's a whole bunch of us who are stuck looking admiringly at the single grain of sand and believing that's all there is. Sure. And so what I heard was consciousness is source-saturated self-awareness. When psychology and medicine, or even science, physicists like yourself, are wrestling with the notion of consciousness, for instance, in quantum mechanics, and the realization that the observer, gravely influences what is observed, whether, for instance, that light is a wave or a particle. And so at every level, consciousness is a conundrum for people. Now, so consciousness, we all would agree that it involves some level of self-awareness. That whether it's a bunny rabbit, or a human being or a guru, that there's a level of consciousness. The bunny rabbit is aware, for instance, that there's a fox chasing it, and so it's trying to escape. Even flora have some kind of self-awareness. A sunflower is going to orient itself towards the sun. It'll shift. Now, I'm surrounded right now, and I'm sure Bill and Sharon are, with California poppies. Every morning, the poppies are closed up. It's like the bonnet is closed, and when the sun comes up, they open up their bonnets. And so that's a level of self-awareness and awareness of an environment, that the flower can sense the activity of the sun, and it responds to it either by orienting it differently or opening up. So every level of life, has some level of self-awareness, even down to the level of, minerals. A rock, in some senses, is responding to the environment, whether it's rain or wind, or snow or whatever. And there's a biochemical conversation that goes on between the elements and the stuff in the rock. So even though it's non-organic, there's still a level of consciousness that's allowing it to react biochemically to what nature is doing around it. And so awareness of some kind is kind of key when we're talking about life. Now, self-awareness then is graded. The level of awareness, for instance, of, let's say, a banana slug is very, very different from a human being. If I see a banana slug crawling along the ground, and I put an apple right in front of it, visually, it's going to take the banana slug 3 seconds to process visual stimulation. It's going to take 3 seconds before the apple registers on the visual cortex of a banana slug. So if I put the apple in front of the banana slug and remove it after 2 seconds, the banana slug won't register the apple. Now, for a human being, that time period is shrunken down to 1/23 of a second. The processing time, the visual processing time of human optics is 1/23 of a second. So if something happens in a shorter time than that, we won't register it visually. And so you get stuff like, for instance, subliminal advertising, where they flash a scene on a television set, but it doesn't last 1/23 of a second. So the eye isn't actually consciously registering it, but it's getting into the brain. So it's subliminally being taken aboard. And so then the level of self-awareness is very different from organism to organism. So that's kind of the second part of my understanding of the definition I was giving. Self-awareness is different from awareness, and there are gradations of self-awareness. Then the source saturated. Saturated obviously means that through and through, it is permeated by God or by source, so that there is nothing that is appearing anywhere in creation, or there is nothing which is either aware or self-aware, which is not dependent upon God in order to be able to operate in that fashion. So it's saturated in the sense that through and through, it's filled with that. And what it's filled with is source itself. So there is nothing which is not God incarnate. And that's why I keep saying that everything that exists is a word of God made flesh. When we read John's gospel and we read the prologue that says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Everything that was created through him, and without him was made nothing that was made. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we think this just happened once. that only one word of God became flesh and we called him Jesus. And that's totally wrong. Every word of God becomes flesh. And that's why in my mantra I say, I am, one of them is, I am Logos residing in the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Jesus is Logos, or Logos is a Greek term meaning the meaning of, or the kind of the study of. And so in some senses then, there is nothing in the phenomenological realms. By that I mean the realms that can be understood, experienced or sensed in some form. There is nothing in the phenomenal realms which is not God incarnate. And so it's saturated through and through. There is no part of it which does not contain the divinity, and it is the divinity that activates and animates everything that is. So that will be then the four words. It's from source, it saturates everything, and self-awareness is a very, very high form of awareness in general. Here's the interesting thing that I know about you, Karen, is that your way of giving a voice to plasma is through your art. You do that all the time. And so the people who've never lost their kind of creativity or their connection to source are little children, prophets, artists, and great scientists. And that's different from just mere technicians. The technicians are the people who take the science and they convert it into some kind of an engineered artifact. But the great scientists, like, for instance, like Albert Einstein, when Einstein was being, kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The president of Princeton was trying to persuade Einstein to leave Europe and come to Princeton. And the president was used to kind of getting really top class scientists and equipping the laboratories, spending thousands of dollars on equipping the laboratories. And the story is that when he was talking to Einstein, trying to persuade him to come, he said, Dr. Einstein, what are you going to need in your laboratory? And Einstein said, I'm going to need a table and a chair and a bunch of pencils and a lot of paper. And the guy says to him, and what kind of equipment? And Einstein says, no, that's enough. And it was enough. Because what he did is he followed his imagination. He would climb aboard an electron and travel into space at the speed of light, and then to mass, into space, into distance, into time. So the great scientists, the great artists, the great prophets and children are the people who've maintained very, very active imagination in the sense in which I'm defining it. And so you're seeing that your grandchildren are able to articulate that because they're in full sensory contact with that through the veil. But you're still in contact with it through your art. And so is any artists, prophets, great scientists, and little children. They're the ones who've kept their imagination and their creativity alive. Yeah, it was an amazing experience. I'm not a horticulturalist of your ilk, Bill. And my garden is nothing like what your garden is. But I always remember, the poppy is a kind of a nice cone shaped. It's all gathered together tightly, wound around itself, and has this green bonnet. And as I watched you over a period of hours, as it began to kind of expand, it was forcing the bonnet up higher and higher on its head. And finally, it just popped the bonnet, and the bonnet fell off. And it was like a little, if you look at the pixies or the fairy folk in mythology, it looked exactly like a little pixie hat. And then I looked around, and the whole ground around the California poppies was loaded with these discarded bonnets. And so it just reminded me, that the extraordinary intelligence of nature that knows, how to cloak itself, how to protect itself, how to nourish itself from sunlight. And nature is the greatest teacher we have. That's a brilliant question, Joe. And I'm totally convinced that autistic children or children on the spectrum in general, are a special kind of gift that our planet has been giving at this stage. And I say two things about it. The first thing is that autistic children very, very frequently have extraordinary abilities in specific areas like mathematics or art or whatever. And so geniuses, an autistic child who can go into a parking lot, in Safeway and see 500 cars and register the license plates of every single car and the make and come home and write down the list. Or there's a famous young man in London he's now in his 30s, a brilliant artist. And they take him up in a helicopter. They've done this, for instance, in Rome, took him up in Rome in a helicopter, up to about 5,000 feet, and showed him Rome, for about a half an hour, and brought him back down, put him into a studio where there's paper all over 4 walls, maybe 80 feet of paper, and he drew the entire Roman skyline. And for every single building, he had the exact number of windows, even in skyscrapers. And so a lot of these children have extraordinary specific abilities. They seem to be, limited in some abilities, like their social connection. And I think the reason for that is that, as I said, the brain actually is a filtering mechanism. If the brain were to allow through all of the sensations we have, it would be totally overblown. And so we knock it down to a trickle. But sometimes with diseases of various kinds, either with their chromosomal aberrations or their birth, defects during the birthing process, or due to an accident, that a filtering area of the brain is knocked out. And so we can't filter anymore. And so the data are coming through in a huge, like a download. And these kids are getting those downloads. And the second thing is that the ego is actually the protection that the human brain has against being overwhelmed by all these data. And so the ego is the ability to kind of shrink down our reality and allows us to interface with people meaningfully. Often children on the spectrum, don't have a very strong ego in the sense that they don't have social skills. They don't know how to interact with a whole bunch of people. And the reason is that they're in such overwhelm by the data they're getting in specific areas, also handle, having to kind of interface with a whole bunch of people and say, good morning, how are you? It's a nice day. They're not interested in that. And the third thing I would add to it is, there have been special kinds of children coming onto our planet since about 1999. The first group was called the Indigo children, and they're very, very gifted. The second group were called the Crystal children. But what they find is, for many of them, it's their first or second incarnation on planet Earth, and they're totally floored by it. They can't believe the amount of darkness and the amount of evil and greed that they're experiencing, and they're not able to operate in the world. And so there's a kind of like a defense mechanism that protects them against being kind of contaminated by the violence and the darkness and the evil they see around them. So they've volunteered to come down here to kind of push Christ consciousness, but they're overwhelmed at the enormity of the task and the selfish agendas of so many of us. And so that some of them even regret the fact that they've even volunteered to come. And so then I am really, really grateful for the fact that so many of these children manage to land in households where they're not seen as, retarded. Joe can see their soul and their spirit, and that you can realize precisely what is the gift that they have come to give us. But the wider society just sees them, as a drain on our kind of on our health services. The spiritual people among us see them, as those who've come to awaken us from the stupor, of our greed and our war making. So you're a lucky man to have a grandchild who will lead you even deeper into the mystery. Mazel tov. Thank you, Pet. And when you look at children, Ingrid, that's the essence. Yeah. As Karen pointed out so beautifully with her own grandkids, kids are excited about everything. To be even gross about it, they're excited by their own poop. They'll do art on the wall of the bathroom if you leave them with their own poop. So everything excites them. So you're absolutely right. Excitement is the beginning of the journey into the mystery.